What happens when a royal exit meets a journalist's relentless cross-examination? Meghan Markle sat across from Piers Morgan, defending her choices while facing questions that cut like a political hearing. From tradition to media battles, family ties to accountability, their clash exposed more than personal grievances. It revealed a struggle over power, truth, and public trust. The studio lights came up, and the conversation began with a question that has followed Meghan Markle since 2020. Why did she walk away from the monarchy? Meghan leaned forward, her voice calm but firm, presenting her choice as an act of independence. To her, the royal institution represented centuries of tradition, but also centuries of limitation. She described the monarchy as an outdated system built for another era, a structure that, in her words, no longer aligned with the reality of modern life. For her, stepping away was not a betrayal, it was survival, both emotional and personal. Piers Morgan, seated across from her, wasted no time pressing the issue. His tone carried the sharpness of a prosecutor cross-examining a witness. He argued that Meghan had not just rejected an institution, she had rejected the responsibility that came with marrying into one of the world's most recognized families. You accepted the Crown's platform, Piers countered. But the moment it grew inconvenient, you walked away. Doesn't the public deserve an explanation? The exchange quickly took on the energy of a political hearing rather than a celebrity interview. Meghan, choosing her words carefully, drew parallels between her position and that of any American seeking autonomy from outdated systems. She framed her departure as a form of self-determination. In her view, the monarchy functioned less as a family and more as a political machine, one that thrived on public appearances but failed to protect its members privately. Piers fired back, pointing out the privileges she had gained: global recognition, a royal wedding watched by millions, and influence few could ever dream of. You used the crown as a stage, he said sharply, and then dismissed the very tradition that gave you that spotlight. The audience in the studio sat in heavy silence as the two clashed, the debate sounding less like celebrity gossip and more like a dispute over government accountability. Meghan insisted that respect for tradition should never come at the expense of personal well-being. Piers insisted that public roles demand sacrifice. By the time this first exchange ended, the tone was unmistakably set. This was not a light-hearted conversation about Hollywood or charity work. It was a battle over principles, duty, and truth. Meghan presented herself as a woman breaking free from an oppressive structure. Piers painted her as someone who abandoned an institution when it no longer suited her. The stage was no longer just about the royals. It had become a broader reflection on power, privilege, and responsibility, themes as familiar to Washington as to Windsor. If Chapter 1 was about duty and tradition, Chapter 2 cut straight to the fault line that has defined Meghan Markle's public life: her battle with the media. Piers Morgan opened the segment with a challenge that carried the edge of a Senate inquiry. You speak about privacy, he said, his words deliberate, yet you've built entire platforms on global exposure, television specials, streaming deals, interviews with some of the most powerful names in media. Isn't that selective? The question drew a sharp reaction from Meghan. She adjusted her posture, as though preparing to defend herself at a witness table. There's a difference, she responded, her voice rising slightly. Privacy is about boundaries. It's about choosing what to share, not about hiding. I have a right, like any citizen, to decide where the line is drawn. The exchange quickly evolved into a duel of principles. Piers framed the issue as public accountability. In his view, once a person steps into the spotlight, whether through politics or royalty, they forfeit the right to absolute privacy. He compared Meghan's position to that of elected officials who cannot simply walk away from public scrutiny when it becomes inconvenient. You can't have the influence without the inspection, he pressed. Meghan countered by painting the press as an unchecked power of its own, likening it to a political machine that thrives on scandal. She argued that her family had been subjected to a level of intrusion that crossed into harassment, and she made it clear she considered the media complicit in her struggles. This isn't transparency, she said firmly. This is exploitation. The audience reaction was split, some nodding in agreement, others frowning at what they saw as evasion. The tension in the studio mirrored a broader public divide. Was Meghan a victim of relentless press culture, or was she attempting to control the narrative while still benefiting from its reach? Piers, not backing down, pushed further. So when the press writes something you dislike, it's harassment. But when you sign a multi-million-dollar media deal, it's storytelling. How do you reconcile that contradiction? Meghan did not waver. Instead, She redirected the focus to what she called the human cost of unchecked reporting. She spoke of sleepless nights, of strain on her marriage, of moments where she questioned her own safety. In that moment, her argument transcended celebrity drama and echoed debates Americans often hear about press freedom versus personal rights. By the close of Chapter 2, the contours of the conflict were unmistakable. Meghan cast herself as a woman under siege by a predatory press. Piers cast her as a public figure attempting to rewrite the rules of accountability. It was not simply an argument about gossip. It had become a referendum on the boundaries between free expression and personal freedom, an issue as relevant in Washington as in Westminster. When the discussion turned to Prince Harry, the studio's energy shifted. What had started as a clash over tradition and media scrutiny now moved into the deeply personal territory of family loyalty, a subject that often draws more heat than policy in American politics. Piers Morgan leaned in, his tone pointed but controlled. Many people believe you've driven a wedge between Harry and his family. He stepped back from royal duties, distanced himself from his brother, and clashed with his father. Are you willing to accept responsibility for that? Meghan's response came with a measured pause, as if weighing every word. Harry makes his own choices, she said firmly. He is not a child to be led. He saw the environment we were living in. He experienced the lack of support, the relentless pressure, and he made the decision to protect his family. That is his right as a husband and a father. The moment had the cadence of a political hearing, with one side demanding accountability and the other framing the issue as independence. Meghan portrayed Harry as a man of agency, breaking free from what she described as a system that values optics over well-being. To her, the separation was not manipulation but liberation. Piers, however, framed it differently. He likened Harry's estrangement to a breach of public trust, arguing that royals, much like elected officials, are bound by duty beyond personal preference. You talk about freedom, he countered. But what about obligation? Doesn't Harry's absence weaken the institution he was born to serve? The audience reacted audibly, some clapping in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably at the bluntness of the question. Meghan, undeterred, doubled down. She spoke of mental health struggles, of moments when Harry felt unsupported, and of his determination to break a cycle of silence. In her telling, Harry was not abandoning his family. He was refusing to sacrifice his well-being on the altar of tradition. The exchange carried echoes of debates familiar to American viewers, the tension between loyalty to an institution and loyalty to one's own conscience. Was Harry a deserter, as critics implied, or was he exercising the same right to redefine his future that Americans prize in their own leaders? By the close of the segment, the divide was clear. Piers portrayed Meghan as the architect of Harry's break with duty. Meghan painted herself as a partner standing beside a man making his own hard choices. The clash was no longer just about the royals. It was about whether personal freedom can ever coexist with inherited responsibility, a debate as relevant in Buckingham Palace as it is on Capitol Hill. The conversation grew sharper when Piers Morgan raised a subject that had lingered in headlines but rarely been addressed directly by Meghan Markle, the allegations from former palace staff. Reports had claimed she was demanding, even bullying toward employees. The tone in the studio shifted, less celebrity gossip, more like a high-stakes oversight hearing. Former staff have described you as difficult, Piers began, his voice calm but unmistakably prosecutorial. They've spoken of unreasonable expectations, of feeling mistreated. Are all of them lying? Meghan's reaction was swift, her expression tightening as she dismissed the claims outright. These are faceless accusations, she said. Cowards hiding behind anonymity. If people had real concerns, they should have raised them directly, not whispered them to tabloids. Her words carried the sting of defiance, casting doubt on the credibility of those who had spoken against her. But Piers pressed the issue, framing it as a question of accountability. In public service, leaders are judged not just by results but by how they treat the people around. Presidents, governors, senators, all must answer to their staff and constituents. Why should you be held to a different standard? The challenge struck at the heart of a familiar American debate, whether those in positions of influence are willing to accept responsibility for their leadership style. Meghan refused to concede ground. She argued that the palace environment itself was toxic, a system designed to undermine outsiders rather than support them. In her account, the criticism was less about her behavior and more about resistance to change. The audience was split once again. Some nodded at her rejection of the charges, seeing her as a woman unfairly targeted by an institution eager to protect itself. Others, however, shifted in their seats, unsettled by her unwillingness to acknowledge even the possibility of missteps. Piers seized on that gap. So you won't admit to any mistakes? Not one. Isn't leadership partly about recognizing where you could have done better? His tone carried the weight of a closing argument. Meghan's response was blunt. The mistake, she said, was trusting a system that was never built to support me. I did what I had to do to survive, and I will not apologize for that. By the end of this exchange, the divide was unmistakable. Piers framed Meghan as someone unwilling to accept responsibility. Meghan cast herself as a reformer crushed by an unyielding institution. It was no longer just a debate about palace staff. It had become a referendum on leadership, accountability, and whether personal conviction excuses hard edges in the pursuit of survival. A question as relevant to Congress as to Kensington. By the time the conversation reached its final stage, the studio felt less like a talk show set and more like a congressional hearing spiraling out of control. What began as pointed questioning now descended into open confrontation. Piers Morgan leaned forward, his tone cutting. You framed yourself as the victim at every turn. Tradition, the press, the staff, the family. At what point, Meghan, do you accept responsibility for your own role in the saga? Meghan's reply came with a sharp edge. This isn't about victimhood. This is about truth. You sit here pretending to hold me accountable, but all you're really doing is running a spectacle. You thrive on tearing people down because it gives you ratings. That's your business model. The audience reacted audibly, some clapping, others murmuring at the intensity of her words. For a moment, it felt as though the walls between journalism, entertainment, and politics had collapsed. The exchange had become a referendum not just on Meghan, but on the media itself. Piers, unshaken, fired back with the cadence of a closing statement. You wanted the platform. You wanted the influence. And now you want to dictate the terms under which the world views you. That's not transparency, that's control. You can't silence critics by painting yourself as oppressed every time you're questioned. The two locked eyes across the table, their exchange echoing the high-stakes standoffs Americans often see in hearings on Capitol Hill, where the line between truth-seeking and political theater blurs. Meghan refused to step back. She accused Piers of exploiting her story for his own gain, of turning complex issues into tabloid headlines. You're not interested in accountability, she said, her voice rising. You're interested in power, and I won't be a pawn in that game. The tension broke only when Piers, visibly frustrated, ended the interview. If you're not willing to answer the questions, he said sharply, then this conversation is over. He gestured toward the exit, dismissing her from the stage. Meghan stood, gathering herself before delivering one final retort. History will decide who is telling the truth here. And it won't be written by you. With that, she walked off set, leaving the studio in stunned silence. For viewers, the confrontation was more than a celebrity spat. It was a clash over power, accountability, and narrative control, issues as familiar in American politics as in the British monarchy. Piers had framed the debate as one of responsibility. Meghan had framed it as one of survival. And as the lights dimmed, one truth was clear: the court of public opinion, not the studio, would deliver the